Draw distance. By R. Adelaide Newhall. Forward. Far from far away. The distance drawn from one point to another may reach only as long as the hand of its creator. The displacement of worlds requires the permutational warpings of space, time, and imagination. It would come to be that this wanton act required only a moment of the ages, and in this tenuous moment, gravity in congress with the steeping topology before it would be triumphantly surmounted. Gravity was not pleased with this turning of events, and time could do little but dither in solidarity and quiet disapproval. Regardless of the sentiments of time and space, they would nonetheless yield, and in surreptitious protest, spit the traveler Jeremy from their empyrean folds and into a vestal detritus. Chapter 1, Fields. The fields of wheat travelled across the horizon at what first appeared a slow pace, but upon the retreat of the eye, the stalks quickened their journey. Pulling back from the immediately observable plane and allowing one's perception to broaden, one would see a red bicycle creep into view, clashing against the harvest and road as a morning sunlight beat down from above. With the wind running its fingers through his hair, Jeremy kicked against the pedals as his tires shot red earth and rock into the atmosphere of the waking day. Of course, this isn't Jeremy today, but if you looked long and deeply enough, you might catch a glimpse of the lingering spirit that still dwells within. You might still discover a spark hidden beneath a stained t-shirt under a white lab coat and ID badge on the third floor of EarthVat Initiatives.
Hi, Jeremy,
Exclaimed Tricia, as she entered the lab.
Are you still analyzing those soil samples from that interesting site up north?
Jeremy wasn't too fazed. He knew what this job was and that he had a knack for selecting cases that were of questionable merit.
Yeah, and did you know that mushroom spores can survive the vacuum of space?
Is that so?
Oh yeah, and the radiation too. I think they'd make great astronauts.
Tricia laughed.
Well, you've got some stiff competition there, buddy. You better ramp up your aptitude studies and get some hours on that T-38. I hear they like to play rough, and that there's some spore losers.
Jeremy didn't look up from his microscope, so perhaps this was the reason he surrendered a careless smile across his face.
Haha, very funny. Hey, how did you know I wanted to be an astronaut?
Tricia, catching the smile, walked toward the rear of the lab.
How could I not know? Your desk is cluttered with space-related paraphernalia, and you own at least 5 NASA hoodies and shirts of varying gray to white palettes. You are up to something.
Jeremy finally broke from his canvas of sand and silt, and looked down at his chest. It doesn't need to be said that his wardrobe betrayed him, but it can be said nonetheless, as it is amusing.
I'll have you know, I've actually been studying and working alongside NASA. 6 months ago I applied to try out one of their new experimental planes. It's a small dream of mine.
Jeremy was a different person than he was 20 years ago. He had learned his lesson of putting the cart before the horse. He had convinced himself he was prepared to stand on his own 2 feet. He continued, settling back into his microscope and soil samples.
I am pretty enthusiastic about space and life somewhere else. In fact, I have an appointment with them tomorrow.
Oh, that's pretty cool. I like that. I've kind of wondered what you wanted outside of this job. Jeremy, if you go to the stars, promise you'll send me a postcard. By the way, are you good for lunch?
I'm good. Thanks, Tricia, and thanks for not laughing.
I'm just glad you're not lost in the woods, Hansel. Well, I have to visit another site after lunch, so I'll see you on Monday. Don't work too hard.
Jeremy watched in a subdued wonder as Tricia disappeared behind the double doors. Their relationship was truly professional, but there was a small admiration that dwelled there. Perhaps nothing that would evolve in this lifetime, and that was okay. As the minutes rolled and Jeremy started to realize his gaze was traveling past the eyepiece of the microscope and beyond the petri dish below, he decided it was time to break for a late lunch. Time management as a skill had never been a defining quality of his. Time was something he looked at as a commodity he would ignore today and control tomorrow. In the end, it would be irrelevant once he was picked for the program and got on that spaceship. On that day, time would operate on his terms. He was willing to put his only entry into existence on it. One might wonder what would motivate the drastic actions of a mind venturing from innocent, carefree child to one determined to leave all it had ever known. To be so comfortable with the endangerment of self, but one can rest assured this goal had not been made in haste, nor without careful thought. This decision had come born of many months of self-reflection, dictated by a triumvirate of curiosity, valorous spirit, and the desire to see beyond oneself. There were trials and tribulations and secret months of psychotherapy. Various boot camps and workout regimes courtesy of the space program were laid out to prepare him for the sheer lack of information he was about to encounter. All good ideas, for it is the fear of the unknown which prevails as the greatest haunt of all. Of course, there was also guilt to deal with. Leaving behind the people who would care for you is one thing. Leaving behind all that would define yourself is another. It would be easy to say that Jeremy was acting upon a temporary crisis or a whim which could blow over as easily as a year turns its pages, but to Jeremy, this was his validation of purpose. He had tried to succeed in many things, but nothing had rewarded him in the slightest. He had stared into dirt for 10 years, all the time longing to gaze at the stars. It was good money though, and a small stint as a kid out of high school and into a work placement program coupled with his congenial disposition landed him a job he was unqualified for, but grateful to stay in. Loyalty was important to Jeremy, but aside from the friendship with Trisha, he believed that the decade had passed him by in an unceremonious afterthought. Some people would interpret tragedy as the loss of a family member, whereas Jeremy saw tragedy in his omission from recognition. He didn't enjoy that he felt this way, and many would agree it is never right to weigh one's fortune or misfortune against another's, but nonetheless the feeling was there. If Anubis were to come one evening and set Jeremy's heart against the feather of Matt, then Jeremy would sleep well knowing he would wake, rested and ready for a new life in Aru. All of this to say, despite the presence of a desire to do good, when a person begins to feel irrelevant there comes a jump in the scale of feats that can reassure them otherwise. It might take an act of something greater to pull one out of the doldrums or rise from their humble pond, and Jeremy was to be the benefactor of such a thing. It was the arm of fate which declared that though Jeremy was preparing to undertake a journey akin to a suicide, because for all intents and purposes, Jeremy would disappear from the only planet which acknowledged his existence. The ride home from the lab that night was uneventful, other than the fact that Jeremy was driving a semi-new Range Rover. A vehicle he had never dreamed would be in his possession, and to be frank it wasn't. It was a loaner, as Jeremy's real car was in the shop for transmission-related issues. Again. But in this moment, he had a new spaceship, and it only bled his imagination further into the line. A generous showing of rain knocked against the outside of the frame, and Jeremy was especially impressed at the lack of noise made from the new windshield wipers. He glanced periodically at his phone, which was tightly fastened to a vent as if expected it should erupt at any moment, but no text message, call or notification came. As the speakers aired a classical period throughout the cabin, Jeremy lifted and rotated his shoulders as if to prepare for his part in the ensemble. This twisting performance traveled up his head and neck, concluding in a relaxing smile of content, perfectly in time with the next cue. Jeremy was no stranger to the minute tickle of music, and held a light fondness for a good recitative and a sharp disdain for the thought there might still exist a baritone with the audacity to perform the aria of Count Almaviva whilst sitting down. The road branched off to his exit, and as he merged, the bright beams of a still more expensive car behind him caught his peripheral. This would normally warrant a negative response, but in the flicker of the RGB spectre, he flinched. He would swear he had caught a glance of something he wasn't supposed to, but rationed it away as the mere refraction of the capillaries on his retinas. There wasn't time to dwell on it as he snapped back, swerving to ensure he turned in time to make his street. The thunder picked up as he pulled into his driveway. Killing the ignition, Jeremy took a second to ruminate on what he had seen. The lightning around him illuminated the trees behind his house, and it caused Jeremy to think about Trisha's comment from earlier that day.
Hansel,
he muttered to himself.
Lost no longer. In the woods no longer.
Clutching his briefcase, he exited the car and only mildly dashed to his front door, where others might have employed a full-on sprint. Skipping up the stairs, he mistimed the utmost step and had to shoot his free arm out to brace himself against the door to keep from collapsing into it. As he did so, he seemed to encounter another instance of something. He began to fiddle with the keys while deducing he might be working too hard after all. Shutting the door behind him, he listened for a few moments before flipping the light switch on. He made no effort to inspect his house, instead opting to drop his briefcase onto the nearest table and drag his feet up the stairs to his room. His walls featured an interesting art choice of retro-futuristic travel posters. Jeremy loved to collect them. There was a comfort in preserving the idea of a past where a bright and innovative future was still possible, if not plausible. While many of his contemporaries flocked to the dystopia of Blade Runner, Jeremy held close to a brighter, happier, and probably boxier tomorrow. He checked his phone. Still no messages. Shrugging off his shirt, he walked to the bathroom and tried to gaze into his own eyes as he brushed his teeth. His eyes were a gleaming blue, just like his father's, though not as blue or as forgiving as his mother's. A deep stare into the bathroom mirror was both a morning and nighttime regularity for Jeremy. He had done this ever since, as a child, he looked into his great-grandfather's pupils and became startled with how faded they were compared to his own. Though he would never bring this up to anyone else, he had continued this bathroom ritual as if to ensure he was still within the former half of his mortality. Knowing he would wake up one day and look into a faded blue ocean was a personal Guernica he refused to acknowledge. There is always concern in watching oneself age. Jeremy likened it to existing in a great theatre, to observe a divine comedy from the Apadana of Darius, yet submit to a conclusion as those before was the folly of all follies. Jeremy looked into his reflection, washed his face and looked himself up and down one last time before turning out the light. He thought how disappointing it was that this organic frame would one day fail him, but such are the thoughts of the tired human mind in its careless nanoseconds of freedom. The brain might be its own greatest critic. For to navigate, to endeavor each day with equanimity substantiates the Homo sapien worthy to rule its microcosm. As he settled into bed, Jeremy looked out the window at the rain against the glass, and finally to the sky. He only took a few breaths before his eyes closed and dreams found him. In the grand scheme of all that is, blame can hardly be placed on an individual to feel insignificant from time to time. Questioning purpose is a pillar too unforgiving to stand on, and one that can cause a man to fall.